So today's notes are going to be over the American Revolution in 3.5, and we're really going to use these notes to kind of apply the things we used from 3.4 and examine how the Enlightenment was actually used to create a new government. So the objectives here, again, these are just really good review for you if you need to study for a test. And then our vocab. So a legislature, this is going to come up all throughout the year and into government and U.S. history, is just a governing body that makes laws. So think of this as like a Congress. That's all it is. Popular sovereignty, this is the idea of limited government where the people choose their leaders, popular meaning people. Treaty of Paris, this is when the United States and the newly formed United States and the British Empire made their treaty, which formally recognized the United States and ended the American Revolution. A federal republic is where government powers split between different levels. I can go over this a little more later because it can be a little bit confusing. And then checks and balances, you should know from reading about Montesquieu. This is the idea where the different branches of government, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, can all stop each other to limit the power of one branch getting too powerful. So the important people of the American Revolution, obviously, we have King George III of England, who kind of kicked the whole thing off, George Washington, Ben Franklin, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson. You probably know Jefferson, but Madison's a very important figure because he's going to be the father pretty much of the American Constitution, which is obviously what runs our government today. So after the French and Indian War, which occurred between not the French and the Indians, but the British Empire and the French Empire, it was pretty much the first world war. It was fought all over the planet, in India, in the oceans, in Europe, and all the way over to the Americas. The British end up winning the war, and they get all the land from France all the way up to the Mississippi River. So you can see here that originally France held a very sizable chunk of North America, a very wealthy chunk of North America, and the British kick them out. The British take this whole area. France actually gives up a large portion of their land to the Spanish, which they'll eventually get back, but it totally changes everything in North America, and it completely rewrites the map. So one of the big things after the war was the king wanted to reassert his power on the colonies. Because of the war, he had not been focused on ruling the 13 American colonies along the coast as much as he had been in the past, and they had pretty much run the war by themselves for a large portion of it. So he wants to kind of show them that he's the king, he's in charge. And one of the ways he does this is what's called the Proclamation Line of 1763. So the king drew a line down the map, and this is pretty much where the Appalachian Mountains are that separate the coastal areas of the eastern United States from the interior of like the Midwest and the South. And the king drew the line, and he said that the colonists could not go past this line and begin to settle this area. This area was going to be reserved for the Indians. This really offends the colonists because they feel like they had just fought a war to claim that area because they had just kicked the French out of it, and they expected to have a claim to that area and be able to go settle there, build businesses there, and essentially turn that land into more colonies. This is going to create like a major rift between the king and the colonist, and it's going to be one of the colonists' first complaints against the King of England, and it's going to start building a lot of that discontent that will eventually boil over into the American Revolution. So the 13 American colonies were controlled by the British. They were along the coast of the Atlantic Ocean. And the reason that the British had these colonies was not for the benefit of the colonies. It's a thing called mercantilism. And mercantilism is this idea that you are trying to use your colonies as almost farms for resources. So you can see on this political cartoon here, the colonies give things to the mother country to make the mother country rich, or the things that the mother country uses. So the mother country doesn't allow, the mother country would be England for this example, or Britain. The mother country doesn't allow the colonies to trade between themselves. The colonies have to send everything back to the mother country. So the mother country makes all the money in this cycle. You never get a colony for the benefit of the colony. A colony is only claimed for the benefit of the mother country. The way that the British enforce this is what's called the Navigation Acts. So the Navigation Acts allow the British to make it so all trade coming to and from the American colonies has to be on British ships and has to stop in Britain. This controls the colonies, it controls the flow of money, but it makes the colonists feel like they're limited in what they can do. So this video is just a video that explains mercantilism a little more in depth. It should be unblocked if you want to watch it to study. So after the French and Indian War, there were some major problems for Britain. First, Britain was in major debt. This was kind of the first world war, I guess you could call it, and it cost a lot of money for the British to fund this war and eventually get victory. So the British also have to station 10,000 troops along that Proclamation Line of 1763 to defend the colonies against the Spanish and incursions by Native American tribes that are going to raid the colonies. So the solution is simply to tax the colonies. The British began to ask the colonies to pay for their own defense. And they did this first through the Stamp Act of 1765, which is a tax on all paper. And while this doesn't seem like a big deal to us, back then, paper, everything was made of paper. That's how entertainment like newspapers and books was printed, playing cards, legal documents, everything was done on paper. So this was actually a tax that would add up over time for the colonies. Second was the Townshend Acts. This was a tax on all imports to the colonies. If you go back to mercantilism, this is kind of a major issue for the colonies because they import everything from Britain. So if they import everything from Britain, they're literally getting hit with a tax on every single thing. So these taxes can really start to add up. And finally, the Tea Act was a tax on tea. The British had a monopoly on bringing tea into the colonies. So again, they had to pay the tax. There was no alternative. These taxes were put on the colonies without the colonists being able to vote on them. And this angered a lot of the colonists because they felt like they had no representation to be able to pick when and what they were taxed for. The other reasons that the colonists began to get more and more angry is they felt that they had some kind of right to rule themselves. You have to remember that back then there were no jets, there were no, international cruises to take you across the ocean in just a few days. This was a 2 or 3 month journey to get from Britain to the colonies. So the colonies pretty much ruled themselves from day to day. They had their own police forces, they had their own militias, kind of like armies. They made their own laws. They had their own legislatures that made those laws. So when the king began to reassert his power again, it began to become a major flashpoint between the colonists and the king because the colonists kind of pushed back, feeling like the king was overstepping his rule. The Enlightenment ideas had also spread to the American colonies. And two of the biggest ideas that had spread and were widely known were first popular sovereignty, the idea that power comes from the people. So when the king began slapping these taxes on the colonists felt like they didn't have a voice in these taxes and they weren't being, notified of the taxes. So it wasn't popular sovereignty. It was essentially tyranny where the king was just ruling over them. Second is natural rights, that people have those natural rights from birth that cannot be taken away. And by the king essentially taking their property through taxes they didn't approve, they felt like their natural rights were being infringed upon. And this really begins to spread throughout the colonies. It begins to build a common American identity and will eventually lead to the revolution. So it all kind of boils over in 1776 with the colonies finally writing the Declaration of Independence and sending it to Britain. The Declaration of Independence is not a government. It's quite literally a breakup letter with the British government and the British king. It is highly influenced by the ideas of the Enlightenment, especially natural rights from John Locke, that there's rights that come from God from birth that cannot be taken away from the people. The colonists list their grievances in the Declaration. You're going to get this a lot in U.S. history, but the grievances are just the complaints that the colonists have against the king. So the first one is taxing without their consent, that he was just slapping taxes on them. He hadn't asked them about it. They didn't have any say in it. He was getting rid of their legislatures. He was literally appointing his own officials and making them in charge instead of the colonists picking their own officials like they had been. And he was taking away their right to a trial by jury. He was just throwing people in prison. There were no charges. It was just because the king or the king's men said that they had done something wrong. So all this kind of makes the colonists feel like the king has broken that social contract and they're now allowed to leave. So the American Revolution is really one of the oddest mismatches in history. It's a bunch of ragtag farmers and a few professional soldiers on the American side versus pretty much the world's best army. Initially, the war goes very, very poorly for the Americans. New York, Boston, Philadelphia are captured. The Continental Army, which is the American Army at that time, is nearly destroyed several times. America loses most of the battles, it actually turns out. It's not a good few years for the United States. The Continental Army is undersupplied, understrength. There's not enough men. There's not enough muskets. There's not enough ammunition. The British Army, on the other hand, is well supplied. It has hundreds of thousands of soldiers at its disposal, has the best navy in the world. So it's really not a good matchup. As you can see, the American Revolution is actually a fairly long war. It was not an intense war, but it was a simmering war. There would be a series of battles and then no battle for almost a year. So it was kind of different from how we think of war now. The turning point of the whole war is the Battle of Saratoga. At the Battle of Saratoga, the Americans hold their ground, surprise an entire British army, and destroy it. And I mean an entire British army. And what this does, it's not as much as it beats the British as it convinces the British's biggest rival, the French, to join the war. So the French want to see the British essentially knock down a peg. And they join the war against Britain because anything that hurts Britain is a good thing, obviously. So the end of the war begins in the early 1780s with the Battle of Yorktown. A whole British army is surrounded by General Washington and the French at Yorktown, and they are forced to surrender. And this majorly shocks the British morale. So this causes the French and Spanish now to fully support the war. Money, weapons, soldiers begin to pour into the American colonies to oppose the British. And the British public just is convinced that the war is not winnable, it's not worth it, and begins to pressure their government to kind of just get out of the war. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris is formally signed, and this ends the war. This ends the American Revolution, and it ends with two major things. One, Britain recognizes the United States of America as an independent nation. They're forced to give up their claims to the colonies. We get our independence. Second, the U.S. gets all territory up to the Mississippi River. So if you look at that map on the left, Britain controlled pretty much in like the goldish color all the territory. But after the war, the United States gets a huge amount of territory. It nearly doubles, possibly triples its size. And this is huge because now suddenly it's not just colonies all over the New World. It's going to be an independent nation that is very, very against colonization. So because the United States got its independence, it has to create a government. We actually have to have a government that's going to run our country. And that government begins all the way back right after we declared independence in 1777 under the Articles of Confederation. You're going to get a lot about the Articles of Confederation in U.S. history, so I'm just going to kind of touch on it here. But it is a major failure. It was not an effective government. It made the central government way too weak. So in 1789, America reforms its government and writes the Constitution, which is the government that still influences us today, well, still governs us today. It pretty much fixed all the major issues from the Articles of Confederation. It was just a major improvement on them. But both of them used Enlightenment ideas. They're highly influenced by guys like Montesquieu and Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau. So the ways they're influenced by the Enlightenment, especially the Constitution, is first the separation of powers. The United States doesn't give all power to a king. It's broken into three branches of government. Our executive, which we know as our president, our judicial, which we know as our Supreme Court, and our legislative, which we know as our Congress. The executive executes the laws, enforces them. The judicial interprets the laws, and the legislative makes the laws. This makes it so no branch gets too much power, and they all balance each other out. Second is checks and balances. This is how the different branches kind of control each other. They can stop other branches from doing something. so that no other branch gets too powerful. And you can kind of see that by that basic diagram in the bottom. It doesn't list them because there's a lot of them, but you can kind of see that each branch can kind of stop the other branch. The third thing is the Bill of Rights, that all citizens have natural rights that are protected from the government, that cannot ever be touched or taken away. Those include trial by jury, speech, press, religion, right to petition, right to bear arms. The idea is it's citizens telling the government, these are my rights, you're not going to take them away. It's not the government giving rights to people. And lastly is the federal republic. This is probably the most complicated of the ideas. Again, you'll learn it in government a lot. But this is the idea that power is split between the national federal government, the U.S. government, and the state governments like Ohio or Kansas or California, that they share power. So the states still have some rights, but the federal government takes care of some of the big picture things. So I hope this kind of helped to make sense of everything in 3.5. And if you need any help, just let me know.